بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So today inshallah ta'ala we'll begin talking about the major conquest of Umar Ibn Khattab radiallahu ta'ala an. And inshallah ta'ala I hope to be able to finish them in 2 weeks, today and next Wednesday. And the age of Umar Ibn Khattab is undoubtedly the age of the most magnificent conquest in the entire history of Islam. So this era is really the golden era of conquest. Not only was it grandiose and completely unexpected, it is also an unprecedented display of military conquest and of reversal in the history of humanity. In other words, it's unexpected. Nobody could have ever predicted this entire change of events in the world scenario. And until today, and 1,450 years almost have gone by, or 1,400 something years have gone by, it remains a cause of bewilderment, of head scratching. How could a group of uncivilized, uneducated, unschooled in the arts of war Bedouins come out of the desert and take on the mighty superpowers of the world and have such miraculous success? Nothing could have predicted that the Byzantine lands and the Sassanid Persia would be completely demolished, or at least carved into half in the case of the Byzantine lands, and demolished in the case of the Sassanid Persia. And if you look at the numbers, it is even more staggering. Realistically, the Muslims did not enter with more than 20,000 people when it comes to Asham, when it comes to all of Syria. They took on the superpower of the world with barely 20,000 people. And the Sassanid Empire, they probably had even less than this, maybe 12 to 15,000 at max they took on. And for them to have this type of success, it truly is something that is, it is a miracle for us. For us it is a miracle. Of course, modern historians, and we'll mention some of these things in our lecture today, modern historians, they look back and they find causes. And some of these causes are legitimate. They will find out, oh, this was happening, this was happening, this was happening. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is musabbibul asbab. Just like when we talked about the hijrah, and we talked about the fact that what happened in Medina created the circumstances that could allow the Prophet to flourish. And the wars of Bu'ath, and the wars between the Aus and the Khazraj, and all of the seniors dying. You can say this is a physical cause, and it's true. But who caused the physical cause? How did this come about? And therefore, we say that perhaps some of these causes are legitimate and valid. And when you look back, they can point to the fact that, oh, the Roman Empire was not a just empire. There was a lot of tyranny going on, a lot of persecution. The Sassanids had intrigues going on. There were factions who hated other factions. And in fact, one of the main generals purposely did not get involved because he was hoping that the leadership would become weakened and then he would take over. So he wanted basically the Muslims to act as a buffer, and subhanAllah, the Muslims came and destroyed the both parties. So you can look back and you can point out to causes, but all of these causes, they just came out of nowhere, out of coincidence, that every one of these causes simultaneously coming together. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you can see how these, so for example, Ahzab as well, right? What happened in Ahzab? How did Ahzab finish? How did Ahzab finish? The weather conditions, right? So again, you can say, oh, the weather changed, and shrug your shoulders if you don't believe in God. But the fact of the matter, again, it's so obvious. So for us as Muslims, all of these conquests and victories truly is a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, we already mentioned the Battle of Yarmouk, which began in the reign of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And of course, the two main battles really are Yarmouk and Qadisiyah. But of course, there are quite literally dozens, if not almost hundreds of other mini battles. And the fact of the matter is, neither do we have the interest, nor the time, nor even the reason to go down all of this list. But we will just mention the 2 or 3 of the main battles and overall historically what happened. And maybe inshallah, I hope next week or the week after I can give you a map on the screen. But it is just amazing if you can visualize that by the time of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq's death, barely the Arabian Peninsula is just about conquered. And to be very frank, one can even say there are spots in the Arabian Peninsula that are really just no man's land. It's not as if, and to this day there are spots that are no man's land, Ruba al-Khali. But besides this, it's not as if even the Arabian Peninsula is fully conquered. But Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala turns his sights on Sham. And eventually Umar turns his sights on the Persian Empire, and from the east, so bit by bit, land after land, province after province. So after the fall of Ctesiphon, which is the capital of the Sassanids, the Muslims go onwards. And all of these major cities in what is now Iran and Iraq and all of these lands, Hamadan, Ray, Jurjan, Azerbaijan, Khorasan, Kirman, Sijistan, and in fact in the reign of Umar Ibn Khattab, Muslims even reach Makran. And where is Makran? In Sindh. In the reign of Umar Ibn Khattab, they reach the land of what is now Pakistan. I mean, this is absolutely phenomenal, that one success after another, and they just keep on going. Now it is true that Uthman ibn Affan, he built on the legacy of Umar ibn Khattab. So wherever Umar radiallahu anhu went, Uthman kind of pushed it forward. That is true. But it was Umar who opened the door, and Uthman radiallahu anhu is simply riding the wave after him. It was Umar who began one province after another. This is in the east. And as for the west as well, the entire what is now modern Syria and Jordan and Palestine comes under Muslim lands. And from here again onto Egypt and Nubia, what is now Sudan, and then Libya, and then Uthman radiallahu anhu takes over, and we get the whole strip of northern Africa until all the way eventually in the early Umayyads we get to Andalusia, as we all know. So the point is, if you look at the map of the Ummah, really the biggest conquests and the most amazing victories in the entire 14 centuries of Islam occur in these years of Umar ibn Khattab. And we go back to the statement of Ibn Mas'ud that we have ever been in Izzah ever since Umar accepted Islam. We have ever been in Izzah since Umar accepted Islam. From the beginning up until the end, Umar ibn Khattab was the one whom, even as the Prophet predicted, he kept on pulling from the bucket, and the bucket became as if it's a big well from which the animals drink, and he kept on pulling, and I never saw anybody pulling like the pulling of Umar. These are the conquests of Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala an. Of course, this is on the political side, and it's also interesting to note that on the intellectual side of things, other things are developing as well. This is the first time that the broader world hears of the Muslims. Jews and Christians, the Roman Empire, the Persians. This is the first time they hear of Islam and the Muslims by and large. And we have to this day engagements and encounters and writings that are preserved from the other side. To this day we have them, how they viewed the Muslims. And some of those stereotypes that existed, that they invented, continue to exist up until our times. And we find literature to this day, and maybe someday, if you guys are interested, I can have a separate talk about how they perceived us in the earliest of times. In the first 100 years is a very interesting talk, and there are a number of specialized books that are present, and people have written about them, where they find bits and pieces in the ancient writings of the Syriac Christians, of the Coptic Christians, of the Roman historians, of the Persians, whoever were writing, and they try to piece together how they viewed the Muslims. And of course, they didn't even call us Muslims, they called us Saracens. Saracens is an ancient word for tent dwellers. So they called the Arabs the Saracens, or they called them Hagarines, the children of Hajar. So Hagarines, like a derogatory term, that Hajar is a slave lady, maid woman. So Hajarines, or they call them Ishmaelites, the children of Ishmael. We are the Israelites, they are the Ishmaelites. So they have these derogatory terms, or even they call them the Arabs. The term Muslim even was not used because they wanted to make them like derogatory. And in fact, interesting to know, by the way, this is, everybody's interested in this, I myself am very interested in this as well. In fact, it is interesting to note that some of the first chronicles that we have, some Christians thought that Muslims were a type of sect of Judaism. Why? How? Because their law was so similar to Jewish law. So they thought that these are some type of bizarre Jewish sect, because Christians did not follow their law. And Muslims did ghusl, Muslims did not eat pork, Muslims were circumcised. So from the perspective of these ignorant Christians, they had no clue who the Muslims were. The first encounters, looking at them and intermixing with them, they assumed that the Muslims might be some type of Jewish messianic sect. As well, by the way, this notion of the Prophet ﷺ having taken from the sources of Judaism and Christianity, this is now when it first comes into play by the non-Muslims of Damascus and whatnot, and this motif remains throughout medieval Christianity up until our times. Because the question, I've said many times, the Quran itself says, the question remains, where did the Prophet ﷺ get these stories from? Clearly, the Arabs did not know these stories. The people of Mecca did not know these stories. مَا كُنْتَ تَعْلَمُهَا أَنْتَ وَلَا قَوْمُكَ مِنْ قَبْلِ هَذَا. Right? Where did you get these stories? وَمَا كُنْتَ لَدَيْهِمْ وَمَا كُنْتَ بِجَانِبِ الْغَرْبِيِّ. You weren't there. You don't know these stories. The Bible was not translated in Arabic. Christians and Jews were not preaching to the pagans of Arabia. So this question, even to the Christians of Damascus and Egypt, they could not understand where are these new group coming from, and they seem to have some type of Judeo-Christian relationship. So these interesting notions came about, but anyway, we're not quite interested in that. So back to our story of Umar Ibn Khattab. So Umar Ibn Khattab clearly understood that in order to conquer these lands, we need to have quality fighters and quality leaders. And all of the leaders that he chose were of the early Muhajirun. All of the leaders were of the Quraysh early Muhajirun, early converts to Islam, because again, you cannot doubt their Islam. And of course, paramount amongst them is Abu Ubaidah Amir ibn al-Jarrah, and he is sent as a commander to Syria. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas is sent to Iraq. Zubayr ibn al-Awwam eventually is sent as well, along with Amr ibn al-As to Egypt. And one of the interesting quirks of Umar ibn Khattab's siyasa or policies was that he was the first person to see that the Banu Umayyah were true leaders. The Banu Umayyah were politicians. He recognized this in them. The Banu Umayyah from Abu Sufyan's progeny. So he was the first to appoint the sons of Abu Sufyan as governors. And of course, this was without him realizing. This is one of those qadr Allah, whatever happened after this, that was the seed of the Umayyad dynasty. Right? It was Umar ibn Khattab who placed Muawiyah's older brother, Yazid. This is not Yazid ibn Muawiyah. This is Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan. There's two Yazids. Yazid, the son of Sufyan, Abu Sufyan, and Yazid, the son of Muawiyah. Yazid was the older brother of Muawiyah. So he was the one who placed Yazid as the governor of Damascus, as we'll talk about right now. And when Yazid died in the plague, the famous plague of Ta'un Amwas, this famous plague that took place, or I should say infamous plague that took place, so then he appointed his younger brother Muawiyah to be the governor of Syria. And once Muawiyah entered Syria, he never left it as a ruler until he died, basically. And he saw from being a minor governor of the province to the major governor of the entire region, to basically challenging, as we know, Ali radiallahu anh, and then eventually becoming the founder of the Umayyad dynasty. All of this basically begins in the reign of Umar ibn Khattab. And of course, Muawiyah at this time is a young man in his 20s. Muawiyah is just a very young man in his 20s, and the Banu Umayyah were known for their siyasa and governorship. And whatever one wants to say about the Umayyads, firstly, as Sunni Muslims, we do not ever say anything bad about Muawiyah, and we don't doubt his intention. Yes, he was not to the level of the great Sahaba, there's no question about that, but he is a Sahabi. So our tongues are pure and clean when it comes to Muawiyah, and whatever ijtihad he did, we don't have to necessarily agree. By the way, we talked about this as well. Respecting the Sahaba does not mean you have to agree with their political decisions. This is not disrespect, but we do not say anything about their niyyah. We do not accuse them of evil or wanting to harm the ummah. They were humans, and the emotions of humans are in them, and so the faults of humans are in them as well. But we do not accuse them of ever wanting to harm the religion. And they might have done mistakes in their siyasa, but it is best to keep clean of saying anything negative, and Allah will be the judge of all of the people. But as for the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhum wa radu an, all of them, Allah is pleased with them and they are pleased with him. So Muawiyah from his ijtihad, as we know, he decided to basically put his son in charge, and that was the beginning of the Umayyad dynasty. But that will happen many, many years later. Now today, inshallah ta'ala, I want to discuss the conquest of two regions, and that is Bilad al-Sham and Masr. So these are the two regions we will discuss, and then inshallah next week we'll go and discuss Ctesiphon and Sassanid empires and Khurasan and all of those others. That will be next week inshallah ta'ala. So Bilad al-Sham, remind me what had happened in the time of Abu Bakr? What had happened in the time of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq? So the expedition had gone forth. The expedition had gone forth, and the battle of Yarmouk had begun. That's the point. That in the reign of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the conquest had already begun. And the battle of Yarmouk was fought in this time, and the conquest of Sham had already begun. And who had Abu Bakr appointed? Khalid ibn al-Walid. Khalid ibn al-Walid. Now, the battles are ongoing in Bilad al-Sham. And it was at this point in time when Abu Bakr passes away, and Umar Ibn Khattab becomes the Khalifa. And the first act that Umar does is he decides to take Khalid out of the position of leadership, and in his place put Abu Ubaidah Amir ibn al-Jarrah. Abu Ubaidah Amir ibn al-Jarrah. And there are many theories as to why he did this. And some of them many of them are found in the books of classical Islam, and the one that is predominantly known to most of us is that he wanted to show that Khalid ibn Walid is not a good luck charm, that it's not necessary for Khalid to be the leader. Now this is a theory, but there are other theories as well, and there's nothing incorrect to point out that there are also narrations that clearly seem to suggest that Umar ibn Khattab did not agree with some of the decisions of Khalid, and he viewed Khalid as maybe being great military but not great as a politician. And frankly, there's nothing wrong with that assessment of Umar if he wants to say that a military person is not necessarily a leader, and he felt that Abu Ubaidah would make a greater leader overall, and Khalid can be used underneath him, which is what ended up happening. So Abu Ubaidah Amir ibn Jarrah, when the message came, as we all know, I'm going to go over this quickly, he tried to stall, he felt awkward, and he didn't want to take over. But eventually the news spread, and Khalid confronted him and said, why didn't you tell me that we're supposed to swap places, basically? And so Khalid accepted the demotion like a true mu'min. And this shows us the ikhlas of Khalid. Whatever was the reason, we really don't care. Khalid ibn Walid accepted the decree of Umar al-Khattab, and he became whatever was the position and continued in that position until later on he rose again in his ranks. And Umar ibn Khattab told them that as soon as you get this letter of mine, march on to the city of Damascus, Damashq. March on to the city of Damascus. And Damascus, much can be said about Damascus. Damascus is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world today. It dates back to over 6,000 years. There's hardly any city in the world that is continuously been inhabited in one region like the city of Damascus. It goes back to pre-Babylonian almost times. And we have evidence, archaeological evidence of continuous human settlement there from as long back as we have human history. And Damascus was the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, and it was really the jewel of whoever was the owners of it because of so many reasons. Its strategic location, its fertile soils, its beauty, it falls straight on so many paths, the east and the west, the Silk Road as well, and the north and the south as well. There was the Rihlat al-Shita'i wal-Sayf, which basically ended at Damascus on one side and Yemen on the other side, and as well it is the Silk Road as well as going through it. So the intersection, and there are other trade routes as well. So the intersection of multiple world global trade routes is happening straight at Damascus. Damascus was the center of political, intellectual, economic capital of almost the world at that time. And Umar ibn Khattab wanted, of course, it for the Muslims. The Muslims surrounded the city of Damascus, and Damascus had 6 gates. And they decided that the only way to conquer the city was to lay it out in siege. cut off the supplies, make sure that they don't have anything coming in. Eventually the people will be forced to basically surrender. And so that is what happened, that they divided themselves up, and each of those 6 gates had a leader. No need to get into all of those details. I didn't purposely go into all of that. Again, these are stories that are, they're not as interesting for us as the details of the seerah. The point is that they strategically laid siege to the city. Now the Romans, again, it is truly phenomenal. Where are the Romans? Where are the Byzantine army? Why aren't they attacking and getting rid of this small force of Muslims? And the fact of the matter is, yes, now modern historians point out this happened, that happened, there was a break of chain here. So all of this, qaddar Allah, everything Allah Azza wa Jal planned. This is a mighty empire, and a small group of maximum 15,000 are marching in, and one city after another. Now it is true as well that Yarmouk was a massive defeat on the Romans, and that really not only demoralized them, caused them to split up, and they could not really gather back together. And even though small skirmishes took place and small contingents did come to try to defeat the Muslims, again, Allah Azza wa Jall's blessings. When you have Allah on your side, you cannot but win. So the Muslims are small, not really prepared. They've never ever had experience of laying siege to a city the size of Damascus. I mean, you want to compare Khaybar, which are small little settlements with one wall, to Damascus, which is one of the largest cities of the world at this point in time. The Muslims have zero experience. But still, subhanAllah, again, it's truly phenomenal to understand one success after another. And the leader of Damascus, the governor, was the son-in-law of Heraclius. It's a family affair, always all kingdoms are family affairs, and the brother and sister and cousin, everybody gets. So the daughter of Heraclius was married to this man by the name of Thomas, and he was the governor and the warrior basically who's in charge of the city. And this man Thomas, he launched a number of attacks, and he tried his best to fight, but after a number of months, some say 4, some say 6 months, basically, how long are you going to fight? Supplies are dwindling, doesn't seem to be any reinforcements coming. Reinforcements were sent, but Abu Ubaidah and others, and Khalid and others had very intelligently basically positioned small contingents or armies on the roads as well. So as soon as they heard of a reinforcement, they would come and attack that, because the city is under siege, nothing can happen now. So they would then send the troops to have a fight, then come back. So throughout all of these months, the morale of the people of Damascus, the Damascenes as they're called, is going down and down, until finally Thomas decides to basically call it quits, and a surrender is negotiated. Now, there has been always a controversy since the beginning of time. Was Damascus conquered or did it surrender? And that is because apparently simultaneously, while these negotiations were going on, Khalid in fact did manage to scale the walls from one side and then launch an attack. And so it is said that the forces of Abu Ubaidah, who had negotiated a treaty, and Khalid, who had attacked the city, they actually met together in the center of the city. And there was a dispute, was this a conquered city or was it a surrendered city? And laws of fiqh changed beyond the scope of our class. But when a city is conquered, there are different fiqh rulings. When the city surrenders, there's different fiqh rulings. But by and large, the Muslims then agreed, whatever actually happened, we will consider Damascus to have surrendered. And one of the perks of the surrendered city is that a surrendered city has more rights than a conquered city. Think about it. Think about it. If you surrender, even in the court of law, if you're accused of a crime, if you say, I'm guilty, automatically your sentence goes down. Whereas if you fight it and then you're declared guilty, then what? Your sentence goes up. This is like human nature, and Islamic Sharia is no different. That when the city agrees to surrender, they actually have some privileges and ranks, and you can put some conditions in. And so the Muslims decided, whatever happened, we'll consider Damascus to be a surrender. And so Damascus came into Muslim hands in the year 14 AH. Now, we'll talk about this more next week, but note here, Umar had a policy that the conquered people should be left separate from the Muslims. The Muslims should not live in the cities of the conquered people. This was his policy. And wherever the Muslims went and conquered, they always built their own Muslim mini cities outside of the conquered cities. And he did this for many, many, many reasons. Of them is that he didn't want the Muslims to feel that now this is their land and they can stop conquering other lands. They should always feel they're on the get-go. And of them, he wanted the Muslim to retain their purity of faith, not to be corrupted by others. And perhaps one could also say, and again, we don't know why all of these things happen, but perhaps one could also say that it is even better for the people who are conquered that they don't feel the presence of the conqueror amongst them all the time. They actually feel free. Now imagine if you see your conquerors walking in and out, they might actually psychologically not be good. So maybe it's better even to leave them alone. So wherever the Muslims went, they built mini cities outside of the conquered cities. And ironically, understandably, those mini cities expanded until the conquered cities were forgotten and the mini cities became the actual cities. And much of the Muslim land today is built on those cities. Kufa was one of those garrison fortresses. Basra was one of those garrison fortresses. Al-Qahira, which was Fustat, which we're going to get to, right? Cairo was originally Fustat. Fustat was one of those garrison cities. Now Cairo is, I think, the second most populated city in the world, or the third most, whatever it is, right? Starting from that garrison city of just the Muslim tents. And then everybody goes there, and the original city is neglected until finally those major... Now, interesting thing. For Damascus, for some reason that didn't work. They tried to, but it didn't work. And Damascus was one of the only cities that the Muslims basically moved into it. And when they moved in, as we know, Islam then flourished after a few generations, and now of course the city is all Muslim. So Umar, after the conquest of Damascus, he commanded Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan to be its governor. As I said, Yazid passed away in the ta'un, in the plague that is called the plague of Amwas. This is one of the worst plagues of early Islam, and tens of thousands of people died. And Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan also died in that plague, and Muawiyah was then placed in charge of Damascus. The Muslims continued marching onwards, conquering a number of key cities of Syria. And again, one by one, as they conquered the cities, the Roman soldiers, the Byzantine soldiers disperse, and the morale is going down and down until finally the eye is set on the prize of Jerusalem. Until finally the Muslims are now basically feeling confident enough to go to Jerusalem. And all of these cities are fortresses. They're all within walls upon walls. Jerusalem is no different. And they laid siege to Jerusalem for 4 months. And the same as in Damascus, many small battles and skirmishes took place. And once again, we really don't quite understand, where are the Byzantine armies now? This is Jerusalem. This is the holiest of holy. This is where, according to their beliefs and doctrines, Jesus Christ walked and lived and died and was resurrected. That's Christian belief, I'm just quoting them. This is their belief. We believe Jerusalem to be the third holiest place. And of course, Bayt al-Muqaddas, all of this is over there. Bayt al-Maqdis is over there. Nonetheless, again, modern historians have their theories. This happened, this happened, this happened. And maybe that's true. A lot of these things are true. But in the end of the day, we say, Allah, the Musabbibul Asbab, simply caused all of these factors, and no major Roman artillery contingent, cavalry is coming forth, and the Muslims are simply allowed to remain in Jerusalem under siege, keeping the city under siege for weeks and weeks and weeks. And finally, the Bishop of Jerusalem, just like Thomas of Damascus, the Bishop of Jerusalem, his name was Sophronios basically agreed to surrender, but with the condition that the Khalifa himself come to receive the keys of the city. The Khalifa come to receive the keys of the city, meaning Umar Ibn Khattab has to come, and only then will I surrender. So Khalid ibn Walid wrote a letter back to Umar, and he said, after 4.5 months, they're willing to surrender, but the condition of surrender, you must come, then they will surrender. And of course, this is the famous story that we're all familiar with of Umar and his servant. And you all know it, of trading places, and then before the city, it's the servant's place. You all know the story. And this is where this story takes place. Now, There is a theory in our times, and again, very, very likely, that the bishop Sophronius wasn't too keen on remaining under Roman rule. And the reason was that the Romans, or the Byzantines, were firstly religiously intolerant, which is very true. They could not tolerate any other strand of Christianity. And Christianity historically has been of the most intolerant of faiths since its inception until basically the Reformation and Renaissance, where secularism was invented and things took a different. Secularism had to have been invented by Christians because they could not live with one another in terms of religious differences. Christianity, and especially at this time, the 6th century, there are so many sectarian issues going on between various groups, so many councils taking place over the nature of Jesus Christ. Who is Jesus Christ? Is he fully human, partially God, partially this, one will, partially that, one will, two wills? Does the Spirit dwell in him? Is the Spirit coexistent? So all of these questions of theology that even the average Christian has never heard of, at this point in time, you are having many, many sects coming about. And each sect cannot tolerate the other sect. And right now we have at least 30 different understandings of Christianity, and especially in Jerusalem. Can you imagine? To this day, Jerusalem, you have all these various versions of Christianity, right? Eastern Orthodox, Roman Orthodox, the Armenian, the Russian Orthodox, you have the Coptics, you have the Nestorians, you have the, of course, the Catholics, you even have Protestant ministries now over there. In those days was no different. So the theory that they, of course, have evidence for is that people like Sophronius thought that it might actually be better to get foreign rule, non-Christian rule, rather than Christians ruling over Christians who are not going to tolerate any other type of Christian. And so this is a very valid theory, and again, if it's true, it goes back to what I just said a little while back, that Allah Azza wa Jalla is musabbibul asbab, and all of these asbab came into play here, and that is why, and it is very true that the level of religious tolerance that Muslims brought was unprecedented for the region. Muslims didn't care what your version of Christianity was. It is true, you couldn't practice Christianity the way that a Muslim could practice Islam. We'll talk about that in a while. But you could practice Christianity in your house and in your church. Judaism in your house and in your synagogue. You could live by your laws and nobody's going to give you an inquisition. Nobody is going to go about and torture you if you believe that Jesus is two wills or one will. If you believe that Jesus is fully divine and fully human, or partially divine and partially human. Nobody's going to quiz you. And this was the freedom that they cherished at that time, and they got it under the Muslims. So this is a theory which seems to be very, very valid, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. So Umar radiallahu anhu, as we know, came with his servant, and it is also said in some books that he asked Bilal ibn Abi Rabah to give the adhan, and Bilal had stopped giving adhan at the death of the Prophet ﷺ. A voluntary self-imposed exile basically, and not exile but not going to give the adhan because it was too painful for him. And so he rarely gave adhan, maybe twice after the death of the Prophet he gave adhan. So this was one of the times he gave adhan in Baytul Maqdis. And subhanAllah, I mean, what an amazing story to think about, right? The mu'adhin of Mecca, the mu'adhin of Medina, mu'adhin now in Baytul Maqdis, and the adhan of Bilal. Obviously, what's it going to do to the Sahaba? Yani you can imagine, and I tried to look as much as possible, but unfortunately, we don't have the detailed accounts of, Umar going to this area that much. We just have bits and pieces. We don't have, and again, this is the reality. Who's going to preserve all these memories? But one can only imagine how the Muslims felt. One can only imagine the awe that they had, and especially coming from where they came from. And the Muslims they hadn't seen these types of architecture, these types of buildings. And now they are walking in Damascus and now Jerusalem. And this is now all under the realm of Islam. And truly it is just a scene out of a type of fairy tale, if you like. It looks like this to us. Of course it's happened because it's the deen of Allah Azza wa Jal. But the very people who were being tortured in Mecca by the Quraysh, now they are walking in the streets of Damascus and Jerusalem as the rulers. Wallahi, it is something, if you just think about it, and it just seems literally, how could this have happened? But that is Allah's religion. لِيُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ. The very people that once could not even pray openly, now they are conquering the largest and the most prestigious cities in the world. and they're walking in its streets as the rulers. And this is again how I wish that we could somehow have preserved even an eyewitness account, but unfortunately not that much is preserved. So Umar Ibn Khattab, as we know, he entered the city. He met with the chief leaders, in particular Sophronius, as we mentioned, the patriarch of Jerusalem, and this was where they negotiated the treaty between the two of them. And this is called Ash-Shurut al-Umariyya, and this is the Treaty of Umar, or the conditions of Umar. Now, this whole notion of the Treaty of Umar, actually I need to pause here and talk a little bit about it, because it is used all the time by Islamophobes. It is one of the key doctrines that the Islamophobes bring up over and over again. The far right, the people on Fox News type people, they always bring this up. Why? Because, to be very honest, the treaty is not very liberal. It's not a treaty that is based on Western liberalism. It's very clear. If you look at the treaty, there are conditions put on the Ahl al-Dhimma. And these conditions are not, in the modern sense, liberal. They're restrictive. Christians have to dress in their clothing. They cannot proselytize, preach Christianity to others. They cannot build new mosques. They can only sustain their old ones. They cannot ring the bell anymore loudly on Sunday. They must have their gatherings in their places. They cannot, basically, they are not allowed to basically be openly Christian proselytizing. They can be Christian in themselves, but they cannot convert others, nor can their religion be given any type of public privilege that would make it appear to be better than Islam. Okay? Whereas, of course, Muslims, the adhan will be given now, and Muslims, and so all of these conditions are there. Now, firstly, realize that the whole story of Shurut al-Umariyya, some people have attempted to dismiss it. I'm not of that opinion. The reason they attempt to dismiss it is because they're embarrassed at it. And so they say, oh, the isnad is not authentic. If we were to start looking at the isnads of history, we would not have any history at all. Because history, by and large, unlike the seerah, even the seerah, by the way, we're lax with the isnads. We talked about this before. The finer details of the seerah, much of it is just oral tradition, and there's gaps and whatnot. If we were to start looking at isnads for each and every incident from the time of the Umayyads or whatnot, we would have no history left. So the fact of the matter is, people want to deny this one incident because it makes them embarrassed. Because when you look at it from a modern liberal light, this story appears backward. The story appears regressive, harsh to the non-Muslims. But the fact of the matter is, it is mentioned in almost every book of history, and the books of fiqh have pretty much all mentioned this as a part of their fiqh. They've derived fiqh from it. You cannot open up hardly any book of fiqh except that you will find, and of the conditions of the Shurut al-Umariyya is that the Ahli Kitab. So the books of fiqh took this treaty as a generic framework, because this is the first time the Khalifa himself, Umar al-Khattab, is now sitting down with the Christians and negotiating the treaty with them. What are their religious rights? Now, of course, the flip side, they're allowed the freedom to be Christians in their personal lives and in their churches. Nobody's going to quiz them. They're allowed to pass that religion down to their children. Nobody can force them to become Muslim. These are all conditions in the treaty. Right? They cannot be forced to become Muslim, that their children will be taught their doctrines in their own. So on the flip side, the freedoms that these people were given were freedoms that they were begging for, they wanted. And the concessions they were asked to make were relatively minor and expected for the people of the time. So had the Romans been in charge, other versions of Christianity could not even have had their churches. Muslims just said, don't ring the bell on Sunday. Do it inside of the church. Okay? So, and you can go on and on. It is a mistake to compare Umar's pact with the Geneva Convention, with America, Canada, England, Australia. It's ludicrous to think that Islamic law will be similar to liberal law. It's not. And people who fall into this trap, you're never going to get out of it. And as you know me by now, I'm not an apologist. The truth is the truth. Islam is not liberalism. Liberalism is its own philosophy. Liberalism is its own philosophy and it has its own roots, and that's a separate topic. To assume that Islam and liberalism have to be the same is nonsensical. Islam is its own, it has its own paradigm, it has its own usul, it has its own reasons. And of the basic premises of Islam is that Islam is true. Of the basic premises of liberalism is that religion is a private area, don't bring it into the public. Of the basic premises of Islam, if Islam is true, then no other philosophy has the right to be preached in public. If Islam is true, then the Muslims should have the dominance. Just like in the nation state, people of the nation state have more rights than people who are not of the nation state. And nobody bats an eyelid at that. Okay? I was born in America. Simply because I was born in America, I have more rights than those of you that are on H1, J1, K1, Q1, P1, T1 visas. Correct? Are you any lesser human than I am? No. Why do you have lesser rights than I? We discriminate on the nation state. Nobody bats an eyelid. It goes over our heads. We think it's normal because that's the world we have been born into. So what if Islam discriminated based on religion? It is the reality. And I talked about this in more detail in other lectures, but we shouldn't be embarrassed and sugarcoat it. Yes, Islam discriminates like every single other philosophy discriminates. You cannot have a philosophy except that it philosophy of politics, except that it discriminates. People have to prefer themselves, whether it's the tribe, whether it's the nation state, whether it's a racist philosophy of ethnicity and racism, but people have to always have privileges that they're going to confer upon us. And the other, whoever the other is not going to get it. In the nation state, look at the rhetoric that mainstream America has for the immigrants. In fact, Europe. Look at the downright racism, those immigrants, right? As if, and literally they're called in America what? Aliens. Look, even the term that is used. Literally they're not, it's as if they're not even human. Those aliens, those illegal aliens. This is dehumanizing. And the blatant racism, right? And I'm going to tangent here, but wallahi, we should not feel ashamed or embarrassed at all about our Islamic law. It makes a lot more sense. People of the same religion, values, ethical laws, they have much more in common than people of a nation state. And that's a whole separate topic I don't want to get to, but the point is, Ashrut al-Umariyya, they seem to be valid, there's nothing wrong with them. And to compare it to a liberal framework, you're going to lose. It's not liberal. But compare it to other civilizations at the time. That's what you should compare it to. Compare it to any other land that is ruled by Christians and see how much tolerance was there. And then see what Umar Ibn Khattab did, and then see if you can criticize. This is really what we should compare with, and therefore the Shurut al-Umariyya seems to be completely valid and there's no reason to simply discard it. Now the story goes on that the patriarch was showing Umar al-Khattab around, and he took them to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is basically the church where it is claimed that Jesus died and was resurrected. Of course, that's their claim. We don't believe this at all, but that's their claim, that that's where he was crucified. And in today's time, of course, this is the holiest of holy places for Christians. The same church is still standing to this day. Well, I don't know if the same structure, but definitely the same location. And Umar ibn Khattab had to pray Dhuhr, and the patriarch allowed him to pray in the corner. And Umar said, no, I am worried that if I pray here, the Muslims will use it as an excuse to build a masjid. And he therefore went outside and he prayed in an open area. And that open area was then converted to a masjid, as he knew what happened. And to this day it is called Masjid Umar. To this day, in Quds, there is a masjid called Masjid Umar, which is outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Anybody been there, by the way? I have not. Any of you have been there? So you went to Masjid Umar, you saw it, the Masjid Umar. So how far is it from the church?
It's pretty close, actually. Not far at all.
Not far at all. Listen, you can just cross over there. That's what I thought. I mean, I haven't been there myself yet. But so the church of Umar ibn Khattab, the Masjid of Umar al-Khattab is in front of the church. This is where Umar al-Khattab prayed. And again, these are legends and stories, and it seems to be true that the patriarch was so impressed with Umar's attitude and demeanor and akhlaq that he handed the keys of the church over to Umar for safekeeping. That now that Umar is the Khalifa, he is the boss basically. So the Patriarch hands the keys of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over. And Umar handed it to one of the local army basically commanders, and it remains in his family to this day, so the legend goes.
No, I seen it on TV or something actually.
So again, this seems to be true as well, that to this day the keys to this holiest of holy shrines in Christianity is in the hands of a Muslim who is from the same family?
Mm-hmm.
The same family, okay. But you haven't seen this yourself, you saw it on the TV?
No, I saw it on TV. It reported the person who has the key and he shows you what he when you do in the morning, open the door and close at night. It's still active till now.
Okay, I would personally, I believe you've seen this. I would love to somehow, if one of us can go meet this family, right? You met the guy?
He was telling me that his family had from one person to one person.
From the time of Umar Ibn Khattab.
Yeah.
MashaAllah. Okay, so this is what I wanted to hear, like the eyewitness verification. Okay. وَشَهِدَ شَاهِدْ مِنْ أَهْلِهَا, huh? We have an isnad now directly. Okay, so again, it's very interesting, mashallah, that we have the keys of the holiest church in Christianity still in the hands of a Muslim whom Umar ibn Khattab handed it to after so many years. And by the way, there's also a quirk here that the Christians like it this way. Why?
They have 4 different denominations and they all fight.
Because the Christian denominations are fighting with one another. And there's tensions. And even there's small areas, each one is assigned. This is the Greek Orthodox, this is the Russian guys, this is the Armenians guys, these are the Catholics and whatnot. So who amongst them would have the key? So it would cause civil war. So to give it to a third party, the Muslims, solves the problem for the Christians. And it is, again, قدر الله, يعني Allah Azza wa Jal decreed this, and it is for everybody's advantage to this day. So the conquest of Jerusalem took place in Rabi' al-Awwal in the 16th year of the Hijrah. It was only a year and a half after this where the Ta'un Amwas, which is the plague, broke out, and over 20,000 Muslims died in Sham. And the plague really also reached Medina and other areas, but the worst was Sham. That was where it broke out, in Sham. And some very famous Sahaba died, such as Abu Ubaidah himself. He passed away in the 18th year. We're still going to get back to him, one or two things other. But in the 18th year Hijrah, he passes away. Mu'adh ibn Jabal, this is the young, he was still young now. He passes away because of the ta'un, because of the plague. Shurahbil ibn Hassan, one of the main leaders as well. Al-Fadl ibn Abbas, the older brother of Abdullah ibn Abbas. Al-Fadl is the oldest brother. And Al-Fadl passes away. Yazid, of course, we already mentioned, he passes away. The son of Abu Sufyan. And 20,000 of the Muslims, they die in this tragedy, which was the plague. And of course, everybody's dying. It's not just the Muslims at this time. In any case, so back to our story. Umar is in Jerusalem. And when he is in Jerusalem, when he's in Bilad al-Sham, Amr ibn al-As asks permission from Umar to invade Egypt. Amr ibn al-As asked permission to invade Egypt, and it looks like Umar wasn't that eager. He was happy to have now come to Palestine, concentrating now on the Sassanids, the Persians, but Amr insisted. He said, this is the right time. The Romans are weakened, they're already debilitated. Now is the time to attack. So Umar was coaxed into allowing him 4,000 men to go. Nonetheless, when Amr made his way to Egypt, Umar changed his mind. And Umar sent him a letter that if you haven't entered Egypt yet, come back immediately. We need you basically for the Persian, for Sassanids. We need you for those guys. Okay? It is said, again, all of these are theories, we will never know, that when the messenger came to Amr ibn al-As, he had a hunch that this would be the message to go back. So he told the messenger, okay, I'll open it in a while. Let's go on till tomorrow, I'll open it. And the next day, he opened it after having entered Egypt. And the letter says that if you get this before entering Egypt, which was the whole point, then you have to come back. And he got it after entering Egypt. So he said, oh well, tough luck. We can't listen to him now because the letter doesn't apply. Okay, so he was very technical because that wasn't the purpose of that clause. The point was that, as soon as you get this, come back. But Yani, qaddar Allah. And of course, our Egyptian brothers are happy and jumping for joy, alhamdulillah, that he did not. He did, and we are all happy for you, alhamdulillah, that Amr ibn al-As continued going. Now, of course, Egypt, I mean, subhanAllah, what is Egypt? Egypt is the land of the most ancient, one of the greatest civilizations, and Christianity had flourished in Egypt. In fact, it is true to say that Egypt was the intellectual capital of Christianity, that most Christian patriarchs or fathers of the church are coming from Egypt, that the quantity of theologians that Egypt is producing is unparalleled, and especially Iskandariya, Alexandria, especially Alexandria. And of course, Alexandria has perhaps the largest library in the world at this time. It is the center of intellectual learning at this time, and the Byzantine Empire was very proud of its control over Egypt. But of course, as usual, there were tensions. Now, Heraclius had handed over the governorship of Egypt to one of his bishops, Cyrus of Phasis. Cyrus of Phasis. The Egyptians called him Cyrus Picokissos. Cyrus Picokissos, because Cyrus was from the Caucasus region. The Caucasus region is a place basically in Russia where the Caucasians come from. Okay? The term Caucasian goes back to this region, the Caucasus. Okay? So the Caucasians, in Arabic we call it the Caucasus, right? This is Caucasus. So this Cyrus guy was from Caucasus. In Arabic, Caucasus, in English, the Caucasus. So they called him Cyrus Picokissos, sorry. And most likely, it is this Picokissos that the Arabs heard and took and wrote down as Muqawqis. Muqawqis. Okay? Most likely. And many months ago, when I was on this point in the Seerah, I said Muqawqis is a title given to the ruler of Egypt. Actually, this is what is mentioned in many history books, but it appears to be not correct. Muqawqis is the Picokissos Arabicized, and is therefore one man. It is not the title of the ruler. It's not like Najashi, which is a title. It's not like the Caesar, the Qaisar, Kisra. This is the name of one man, Muqawqis. Who is Muqawqis, by the way? Everybody should know Muqawqis. Who is Muqawqis? What gift? Maria al-Qibtiyya and Duldul and Sirin and other cloth and whatnot, and he responded with honor and respect. This is that Cyrus. He's still in charge. This is the same guy, Muqawqis. He's still in charge. So this guy Muqawqis actually was a fanatic Christian, a zealot, a religious zealot, and he was himself a theologian who had derived a new aqidah, a new interpretation. All of this is happening in the 6th century about various minutiae, like the details about the nature of Jesus Christ. And to be honest, I don't even fully understand it, nor am I that interested myself in these things, what are all these intra-Christian disputes. But the point is that Muqawqis was sympathetic to basically Diophysite Christianity, which is Melkite, which is proto-Catholic Christianity. The Catholic faith was called the Melkite faith. From the Melkites you get the Catholics, and you get the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox and the Armenians. They all break away. These are the Melkites, and the Melkites are Diophysites. Okay, and the opposite of Diophysites is what? Diophysites. What's the opposite? Very good. Mono, not Euro, not Europhysites. Monophysites, mono. Okay, monophysites. Very good. Monophysites, and monophysites are the Coptics, right? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure if Nestorians are monophysites, but definitely the Coptics are monophysites. Okay, so the Coptics are, of course, the ancient Christians of Egypt. Muqawqis is sent by Heraclius. He is not Egyptian. He is from the Caucasus, and he is a Diophysite, and he derives a new interpretation, whatever, and it's within the Diophysite creed, and he wants to enforce it on the Coptics. He's a fanatic, and he wants all of Egypt that is Coptic to convert to Melkite, or what is called Melkite Christianity, which is proto-Catholic Christianity. It's not quite yet Catholic, because Catholic is going to develop in another 300, 400 years. This is proto-Catholic Christianity. And so there's no doubt that the people therefore hated Byzantine rule, and they didn't want these people in charge. And again, all of this, later historians are now coming and saying, oh, this is why the Muslims could conquer. Okay, maybe. But again, how could it be facilitated at this point in time? Allah Azza wa Jal did it. Okay, one of the main reasons the people of Egypt did not want Byzantine rule, and this is true. They hated the Byzantines. Why did they hate the Byzantines? Anybody who tries to take your religion away, you're going to hate him. This is human nature. And Muqawqis was that type of person. Now, another quirk here, Muqawqis wasn't a pure Melkite. Muqawqis was not a pure Melkite. He's kind of a mubtadi' now. Okay? And he has tensions with the Patriarch of Rome, because he has his own aqidah. And he's tyrannical. So he as well wants to break away from the Byzantines for his own selfish reasons. You guys following, right? All of these are factors that, wallahi, we look back. If you're a kafir, you're an atheist, you're a secular guy, you'll say, oh, look at this. But if you're a believer in Allah Azza wa Jalla, as we are, you will say, it's so obvious. Wherever you look, there are all these reasons coming together. And these reasons are not just coincidence. This is Allah's qadr, that all of these interesting factors come together. Otherwise, how can 4,000 people conquer the land of the great pharaohs? Think about it. How can it be? But again, قَدَّرَ اللَّهُ مَا شَاءَ فَعَلَ. Literally 4,000 people entered Egypt, and the entire civilization. It is one of the most amazing conquests of early Islam. Hardly any bloodshed, unlike even in Damascus and of course the Persians' bloody, messy battle. Egypt was one of the easiest conquests. It's almost as if they're walking in and conquering one city after another. So Amr enters Egypt in 18 AH, and begins conquering the smaller towns of the Nile, one after the other, before he moves on to the big fortress city on the coast of the Nile that they called Babylon, after the original Babylon. This is not that Babylon. That Babylon is not in Muslim rule. This is their Babylon that they named after the ancient Babylon. And just so that you understand, the modern city of Cairo, which is based on the Islamic city of Fustat, was based on the Egyptian city of Babylon. Okay? So you can say Babylon is Cairo, even though that's very simplistic. But this was that same region, Babylon. And it was the big city that they first encountered. And so Amr moved on to the city of Babylon, and he laid siege to it, and they could not win. It was simply too much now. Now they're getting to basically the garrison fortresses. So he wrote to Umar Ibn Khattab that, look, I mean, your letter came to me. I was too late. I was already in the city, in the land, and now I'm surrounding Babylon, and I need more men. And so Umar Ibn Khattab basically agreed to divert some of the men from other places and send them to Egypt. And 4,000, another 4,000 came, until finally he had around 10 to 12,000 men. And included in these was the Hawari Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. Okay, so Zubayr ibn al-Awwam now is now a part of the Egyptian vanguard. And so with this, Babylon eventually basically agrees to surrender, and Muqawqis was very eager to sign a peace treaty with the Muslims. Muqawqis, as we said, wanted to break away from Heraclius, but Heraclius refused to allow Muqawqis to surrender. So Muqawqis sent a letter that, look, there's no point, I need to surrender, and these are the conditions. And Heraclius basically refused to do so, even though Muqawqis wanted to pay jizya. Why? Because once again, all of these are factors that are taking in here, that he wants to be put in charge. He wants his version of Christianity to go forward. Nonetheless, Allah Azza wa Jalla's will that it was not surrendered, and therefore no conditions. Qahira or Fustat or Babylon was conquered, because towards the end of the siege, the equivalent of December in the year 640, a group of Muslims managed to scale over the wall in the middle of the night, opened up one of the doors of the city, and the Muslims basically came in and completely conquered. So there is no surrendering. Muqawqis wanted to surrender, and Allah willed he would not surrender. and that means the Muslims could do whatever conditions they wanted to do. Then the Muslim army turned its eyes on Heliopolis. And Heliopolis was a major center of ancient Greece. And of course, to this day, it is a famous city. Heliopolis, of course, literally is the worship of the sun god, which is why in Arabic it is called Ain Shams. Ain Shams, the sun god, the eye of the sun god, right? And it is considered to be a tourist destination, and it is till today the temples of the ancient gods are here. And they conquered Ain Shams, they conquered Heliopolis, and one by one, we're not going to call up all of this, one by one they're conquering all of these Egyptian cities until finally the biggest and the most important city of that entire region, in fact of all of Africa, is now in front of them, and that is Alexandria. Alexandria, of course, is named after Alexander the Great. He's the one who founded the city 600 years ago. 600 years ago from this point in time. Alexandria is also a very ancient city. And Alexandria was considered to be of the wonders of the ancient world because in Alexandria was the famous lighthouse. You know, there are 7 wonders of the ancient world. One of them was in Alexandria. There was a lighthouse that was considered to be a miracle for its time. And so Alexandria has the largest library. It has the most number of ulama of Christianity, theologians of Christianity. And it is one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world. Because the Romans, before them the Greeks, after them the Byzantines. There were 3 civilizations, the Greeks, then the Romans and the Byzantines. All of them are building their fortresses and walls around it. And Alexandria, one side of it faces the sea, which means it has direct access to Rome, to Constantinople. Not Rome, really, Constantinople right now. And so Alexandria was a huge challenge to the Muslims. And the Byzantine leadership fully understood the dangers of Alexandria falling into Muslim hands. And so all forces converged on Byzantine, on the Alexandrian basically way to try to stop the Muslims from even getting to Alexandria. And in fact, a journey that would have lasted 2 days took the Muslims more than 10 or 12 days to do, because every single, bit by bit, every single half a day or whatnot, they would encounter another troop or another cavalry that had come to attack them. And so that small journey of a day and a half took them almost 5 times that amount to finally get to Alexandria. And finally, Alexandria was surrounded. And they surrounded the city in the year 641 CE. And this city, they could not crack it at all for the longest time. Why? Because plenty of water, direct access to the ocean. So while they're being in siege, supplies are coming in from the Romans, from the Byzantines, because the Muslims didn't have a naval force at this time. They're not stopping the ships from coming in. And the fortress walls are fortified for over 500 years. There's multiple layers outside Alexandria, not even one layer. You have the Greek and the Romans, the Byzantine. Additionally, you have these catapults that have been built in. And the Muslims, again, they haven't seen this technology to this strength before. And the casualties that the Muslims suffered for the next 6 months was in the hundreds, if not thousands. The catapults kept on bombarding the Muslims, and they really did not know what to do. But the Muslims did not give up. And weeks turned into months. Months were almost going to turn into the year, 6 or 7 months basically. But eventually Heraclius himself said, Heraclius the emperor, he said, I will come myself at the head of a naval force and defend Alexandria. This was a huge change of winds. When the emperor is going to come at the head of a naval force and army, and he's going to rescue Alexandria against Amr ibn al-As, what are you going to do? The weapon of dua. What else are you going to do? And subhanallah, again, one of those, again, how do you explain these things? He is on the shore of Alexandria, Constantinople, and he is taking care of basically getting ready of the naval force, and he dies. The emperor dies before ever stepping on the ship. How do you explain these things? Again, for our perspective, all of this is just one by one by one. And of course, what's going to happen when the emperor dies? What's going to happen? Chaos, complete chaos. The whole plan of taking completely stops, right? The entire naval fleet that had been planned ceases because now other issues happen. And by the way, another point here, of course there's internal intrigues, civil war, nephews and other people want to become emperor. You all know Rome and Constantine. I mean, these are not, there's lots of intrigues going on. So when the emperor is dead, who's going to send an army outside? The army simply does not go. And the whole population of Alexandria, from being optimistic to being saved, realized there is no help coming for many months. The siege is wearing them down. And so finally, they simply agree to surrender. They agree to surrender. So Alexandria then indeed does surrender, and Amr ibn al-As comes in as a conqueror, a conqueror to the surrendered city. He didn't fight the people. It is a surrendered city. And it is true, though, that the next year, when the new emperor came to power, he launched a powerful offensive. He kicked Amr out. The Muslims had to evacuate, but only for less than a year. Then they went back in and they reconquered Alexandria, and Alexandria has then remained in Muslim hands up until our times, even though it was threatened twice. It was threatened twice severely. The first time it was threatened in the Crusades. And there was some battles. Because again, Alexandria is a naval city. It's a city where you have access, the fleet has access. And then it was threatened by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1780-182, where Napoleon conquered Alexandria. Napoleon conquered all of Egypt in 2 weeks, and then he abandoned it in one night when he couldn't know how to deal with the people and whatnot. He simply left it after a while, but he conquered it through Alexandria. In any case, one of the famous non-Muslim historians of Muslim civilizations, very famous guy, Hugh Kennedy, has many books about conquest and history. Hugh Kennedy writes in his book, The Great Arab Conquests, that even more striking, talking about the conquest of Egypt, is the verdict of John of, I don't know how he pronounces, Nikiu. I don't know how he pronounces. John of Nikiu was one of the chroniclers of the ancient world. John of Nikiu was no admirer of Muslim government and was fierce in his denunciation. But he says of Amr ibn al-As, so this is a chronicler of the Byzantine Empire writing about Amr ibn al-As. So Hugh Kennedy is translating for us. I can't go back to the original. So Hugh Kennedy was a very famous historian, still alive as far as I know. He's written many books. His most famous book is about Andalus, by the way. It's online. Sorry, it's on Amazon. He's written very good books about Andalus especially, but also about the Arab conquest. So he says, this chronicler writes, so he's quoting somebody 1,300 years ago, about Amr ibn al-As. He extracted the taxes that had been determined upon, but he took none of the property of the churches. He committed no acts of spoliation or plunder, and he preserved his conditions throughout all of his days. So Amr took from us what he had said he would take, and he didn't take anything more. And he allowed our churches, he allowed us to be who we are, and he did not spoil. Spoil means to obviously conquer and to take. He did not harm anybody. He fulfilled his part of the bargain. Even though this chronicler hated the Muslims, but still he had to admit that Amr was a fair ruler. And Hugh Kennedy, who is an expert of Islamic civilization and history, he writes, so I quote from his book, of all the early Muslim conquests, that of Egypt was the swiftest and most complete. Within a space of 2 years, the country had come completely under Arab rule. Even more remarkably, it has remained under Muslim rule ever since. Seldom in history, in human history, can so massive a political change have happened so swiftly and been so long-lasting. Egypt's culture, religion, ethnicity, language literally changed overnight. And it still remains to this day. What does every Egyptian, even Egyptian Copts, what do they speak? They speak Arabic. How did this happen? From a civilization that was in one way, literally in less than 2 years, the Muslims came in, and subhanallah, this great and ancient civilization remains in the heritage of Islam. And Amr, I know people are coming, inshallah, just 5 minutes, I'm done. I don't want to go back to Egypt next week, so I want to finish up. Amr wanted to make Alexandria his capital. Who would not? He wanted to make Alexandria the capital of Egypt. But Umar objected with a very valid reason. Who can guess the objection of Umar? A valid reason. Strategic. It's a naval city. People are always going to come attack it. Okay, you can't have a capital when we don't have a navy that is in water, that is exposed to water. Because again, we didn't have a navy. We had some ships. Those ships got to Sindh and Makran. We didn't have a full-fledged navy. Uthman was the first to begin the navy. It was then the Umayyads that actually then had a full-fledged navy. Okay? We didn't have a navy now. So Umar ibn Khattab, and it truly is amazing. You look at these leadership qualities, where are they coming from? How can somebody who's never ever been in a ship, never ruled a metropolis, never seen the sea, never done so, how can Umar ibn Khattab be negotiating from Medina? And he's telling I skipped over a lot of stuff, even in the siege of Damascus, he is telling the Abu Ubaidah, go do this, make sure you go to Hims, do that. Yani in one siege, and Umar is saying, keep some people there, take another there, take another there. And one wonders, no maps, what education, where, yani if this isn't a genius that comes from up above, you cannot be taught this type of stuff, right? So even now, Alexandria, no, because that city is not safe. So go find another place. And so Amr decided to go back to the second largest city, and that is Babylon. And an incident is mentioned here, again in the books of history, that when he was first in Babylon, when he conquered Babylon, when they were packing up the tents, legend has it that on his tent, a pigeon had settled and made a nest with eggs on it. So he said, let the tent be, don't leave my tent there. And so when Umar said no to Alexandria, he took that as a sign that that's where I need to build the capital. So he went back to that place, and those tents were basically called Fustat. And so he called the city Fustat. And that place where the tent was, eventually he built it into a masjid. And to this day, Masjid Amr ibn al-As is one of the most ancient masjids in the world. And it is in the same, of course not the same building, but the same place to this day in Egypt. And this shows you, where was Fustat? Masjid Amr ibn al-As is in Cairo. Cairo is now so big, Dunya swallows the whole dunya up, right? It swallows everything around it. So Fustat was built outside of Babylon. Fustat grows, and Babylon basically is swallowed by it. The Fatimids come, and the Fatimids want to build their own magnificent city. So they build a city outside of Fustat, and they call it the conquering city, Al-Qahira. Al-Qahira, the conquering city. And they build their Al-Qahira outside of Fustat. And then Al-Qahira grows, until Al-Qahira swallows Fustat and Babylon, and it then becomes, is it the second largest city in the world or what, you know? The third? MashaAllah. So Al-Qahira basically then takes over, but it is Al-Qahira, Fustat. All of this goes back to basically this city. A famous story happens here that Ibn Kathir mentions, that when Egypt was conquered, the Egyptians came to Amr ibn al-As and said that this Nile of ours always blocks at one time of the year, and we have to always do a festival in order to cause it to flow. He said, what is that festival? They said, on the 12th night of this particular month, we always take a virgin girl, we choose this girl from her family, and we pay the family, make them happy and whatnot, and we sacrifice this girl by throwing her into the river to get the Nile to flow. We dress her up and we give her fine jewelry, and then we throw her into the Nile, and then the Nile comes to us. So Amr said, this is something that cannot happen in Islam. Islam cannot allow this. So according to legend, and all of this is legend, at the end of the day there are no isnads, this is found in the ancient books, the Nile did not flow that year. So Amr wrote a letter to Umar ibn Khattab saying, what do we do now? Gave the whole story to him. So Umar replied back that I will write a letter to the Nile. You throw this letter in the Nile instead. So Umar wrote this letter And it is mentioned, Ibn Kathir has this, and Akhbar al-Faki, I forgot, the ancient books, what is it called? Futuh al-Buldan. All of these books, they mention this, Al-Baladhuri and Futuh al-Buldan, which is one of the most classical books. Ibn Kathir is very late. Ibn Kathir is 770 Hijrah. We have the ancient books of history, Al-Tabari, all of these, they preserve these legends and stories. So Umar wrote a letter. This is the letter, translated. From the slave of Allah, Umar, Amir al-Mu'mineen, to the Nile that is found in the land of Egypt. So from Umar to the Nile. Okay? Amma ba'd. If you only flow based on your own initiative, then do not flow, for we have no need of you. But if you only flow on the command of Allah, Al-Wahid Al-Qahhar, and He is the one who causes you to flow, then we ask Allah Ta'ala that you shall flow. This is the letter. So Amr ibn al-As read this letter out to the people, threw it into the Nile, and it is said that the next day the Nile tripled in size. And from that time on, no more virgin girls. Now, some of our scholars have again criticized the story. Again, the isnad comes up, and they criticize it because it sounds superstitious. Okay? Quite the contrary. I don't at all think it sounds superstitious. They say, how could Umar write to the Nile? And honestly, one wonders, with my utmost respect to these critics, do you really think Umar is writing to the Nile? What's the purpose of the letter? The people of Egypt. I mean, it just surprises me that you have these hardcore ulama that just don't understand. They're so narrow-minded in these things, you know. They're not understanding. So how can Umar write to the Nile? This is kufr and what? Subhanallah, you really think Umar is writing a letter to the Nile, that the Nile is going to listen to him? This is a letter for the people, that, oh people, and it's read to the people. Oh people, the Nile is under the command of Allah. Make dua to Allah. And this is Umar's tawakkul. This is Umar's yaqeen and iman, that his tawheed, that the people will see that the Nile is not a god. Because again, the Egyptians, they had this notion, like the Indians have the Ganges River, the Egyptians had the Nile, that the Nile is some type of demigod or something. So Umar wanted to prove to them tawheed. And this was the point of the letter. And two final points, inshallah, we're done. It is also mentioned that Umar had an idea, and he wrote to Umar Ibn Khattab asking permission to do this idea. He said, why don't we connect what is now called the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea? Because this will give us direct access, and supplies and whatnot can come. But Umar felt that this would give the Byzantine Empire direct access to Mecca. Think about it, right? And so he vetoed the idea. Of course, the idea remained in the minds of the people for 1,500 years, and it was only in the 20s and 30s, when the Suez Canal was finally built. This is the idea of Amr ibn al-As. Why don't we dig a canal from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea? Connect the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. This will save us so much time and money. And it was a good idea, but Umar also had a good reason to say no, and that is that the Muslim Ummah was not ready to have that direct linkage from the Byzantine Empire to the Roman Empire. So Egypt therefore came under Muslim control basically in the 18th year of the Hijrah, 18 to 19, and then 20th it was finished. 2 years. By the 20th of Hijrah, the entire land of Egypt, and as well Nubia, which is now Sudan, as well portions of Libya, they began to be conquered. Now, it is interesting to note that Egypt, with my utmost respect to my Egyptian brothers and sisters, did not play a major role in the early part of Islam at all. It was relatively insignificant. It was just a province of the provinces. And it was not any type of center of activity. And it was actually one incident that was to change this forever and to put Egypt on the center of the Muslim world. And that is, of course, the Mongol invasion. Right? When Genghis Khan came out of nowhere and destroyed 80% of the Muslim world and brought to an end the Abbasid Caliphate, and raped Baghdad, and Samarkand and Tashkent were wiped out, and the civilizations that were once of the greatest civilizations never ever flourished. So Afghanistan, for example, where it was, it never recovered, and it is now where it is from the invasion of the Mongols, right? To that time, to that day. Afghanistan, by the way, was one of the centers of civilization back in those days. Samarkand as well, and all these areas. You look still at the architecture in the middle of the desert. In Afghanistan, the middle of the desert, you find these amazing structures, all gone after the invasion of the Mongols. And it appeared Qiyamah had come. One small, minuscule dynasty stood up and fought against the Mongols, and for the first time in human history, won. And that is Al-Zahir Baybaras from the Mamluks. And the Mamluks were a small dynasty in Egypt. Insignificant. They would have been a footnote of one of the footnotes of a book of history. They were completely insignificant in the grand scale of things. But that is Allah's will. تُعِزُّ مَن تَشَاءُ وَتُذِلُّ مَن تَشَاءُ. And He took this small dynasty of the Mamluks, and it became the center stage of the Ummah. And ever since that year of 1261, the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Battle of Goliath, the Well of Goliath, right? The Battle of the Well of Goliath, Ain Jalut. Ever since that time, Egypt has remained a center of intellectual and political activity of the Muslim Ummah for 1,000 years. For the first few hundred years, Egypt did not have that time. In fact, if anything, it was associated with the Fatimids. Right? If anything, it was not the source of pride because of the Fatimids. People were scared and they hated the Fatimids. But subhanAllah, Qaddarallah, Egypt became the capital of even the modern world as well, because of Muhammad Ali and whatnot, and al-Basha and all of this. And to this day, if there is any intellectual and political and basically a civilizational capital of the Arab world, really it is to this day Egypt. And that is why our own president, when he wanted to show that he's making a gesture to the Arab world when he got elected, where did he go speak? In Egypt. In Egypt, that's the whole notion being. The final point, inshallah ta'ala, I know a lot has been done, but I don't want to come back to Egypt next week. So when the Muslims conquered Egypt, Egypt was basically 100% Coptic Christian by and large, because Byzantine Christianity was something else, Melkites. So Egypt was 100% Christians. The Muslims come in, they have less than 10,000 people. You can say 0.001% are now Muslim. Okay. Now, fast forward 14 centuries, and Egypt is roughly 90% Muslim and 10% still Coptic. Okay. And Egypt, because it was a civilization, because records, because it was all, you have plenty of raw data that can be used and has been used, and research has been done to demonstrate and prove that there was never any one era where they just converted all of them. Rather, it was a very, very slow, organic process. Bit by bit, Islam from 1 to 2 to 3 to bit by bit, just slowly coming until pre-modernity, things settle down when colonialism comes, and because of colonialism, tensions between Christians and Muslims rise even more. Because before colonialists came, that type of tension was not there. Tensions between Jews and Muslims as well, because of Zionism and colonialism. Otherwise, that tension did not exist. So why do I say this? We have evidence to demonstrate Muslims never forced their religion onto others. And one of the main purposes of conquering a civilization are now made clear. Why did Islam go and conquer other civilizations? Exactly because of Egypt. You are not going to convert to a faith that is exotic and far away and foreign. And if you do, you will be the one out of the million. You will be the Malcolm X's and the Alexander Russell Webbs of America. One out of million. You will not convert until you see the reality of that faith. You notice, you sense the civilization, the imaan. You interact with the people. And that's what happened in Egypt and in other lands. There was no forced conversion. But when the people are interacting with Muslims and Islam, what happens? Slowly but surely, people continue to convert for whatever reason. Sometimes they convert for the wrong reason. And I mentioned this earlier. And we say, so what? Go ahead and convert for the wrong reason. Allah will bring the right reason in your heart. This is how confident we are of Islam. Maybe many converted to get off the jizya tax. So what? Go ahead, whatever your niyyah is, we're not going to ask your niyyah. Because we're so confident, our product is so good, you're going to start liking it eventually. That's the reality. Correct? That's the reality. So we have this attitude, and we shouldn't be ashamed of this attitude. This is why Islam went out to conquer other civilizations. There's no way people are going to convert. So was Islam spread by the sword? Yes and no. If you mean by the sword, a sword was put on somebody's throat and forced to convert? No, never. But if you mean by the sword the political domain of Islam, then yes. Egypt was not threatening the Muslims that they had to go attack. Damascus, even the Persians, were not an existential threat. Anybody who says this, that these were defensive wars, I'm sorry, you're making a mockery of your own intelligence. These are not defensive wars. What did Egypt do to deserve an attack by the Muslims? They didn't do it, they're living their lives. But if we hadn't attacked, we wouldn't have had 90% Egyptian Muslims. The same goes for us and our forefathers in Pakistan and India. This is the reality. People converted, not by force, never, but by interacting and seeing the beauty of Islam. And this is why, the number one reason why the domain of Islam was indeed spread by the sword. Not the religion of Islam, the political domain of Islam. And we should not be ashamed at all to admit that. And as Hugh Kennedy himself said, no other civilization took root and remained like the Arabs and Muslims in Egypt. And with this, inshallah ta'ala, we conclude our talk for today. And inshallah, next week we'll continue talking about Persia and the Sassanid Empire and other conquests, inshallah.